So during a traumatic situation, there are two basic neurobiological processes that we're interested in looking at. One is what hormones are released and how does that affect behavior during the assault and the immediate aftermath of the assault. And then what is happening with respect to the memory of that traumatic event. Most survivors are going to have one of four main stress chemicals released in their bodies, or some have multiple hormones and chemicals released at the time of the assault. One of which are going to be the catecholamines. Catecholamines are like natural adrenaline. It's what pumps your body up in a traumatic or stressful situation that would help a survivor be able to fight back against the attacker or try to flee from the situation. Another hormone that's often released for survivors during an assault are the corticosteroids, and those work in conjunction with the catecholamines to determine how much energy is available. So again, for some survivors, they have a lot of energy available to fight back and to flee, and they stay very pumped up after the assault. But some don't. It sort of bottoms out and flattens out on them, and they might freeze during the assault, or they might be in kind of a stupor almost after the assault. Other hormones that affect the behavior at the time of the assault are opioids, which is like natural morphine. So some survivors during the assault report feeling like they're almost drugged, that they're out of it, and then when they do first responder interviews later, they have no affect. They're just describing it with no emotion, no affect, like they're reading out of the TV guide. There's just nothing to them. That's the opiates. The opiates help block physical pain, which you need during a traumatic situation, but they also just keep blunting everything. Okay. The other hormone that's sometimes released is oxytocin, and this is a hormone that promotes good feelings. Okay, and that may sound strange. Why would you have a hormone that's about good feelings released during a sexual assault? Again, it's about trying to block the pain, the physical pain, the psychological pain. So the body will release opioids, natural morphine, to try to tamp down the physical pain, and sometimes it will release oxytocin in conjunction with that to try to balance it out. Hormone that promotes good feelings, hormone that tries to blunt pain. Again, it's just trying to mitigate the pain of this assault. But if the oxytocin levels get a little high, sometimes survivors might laugh, giggle, smile, engage in socially appropriate behavior that's socially inappropriate given that situation. So those are the four hormones that can affect the behavior during the assault. And these hormones are really instrumental in blocking the physical pain, helping the body react to the trauma of the assault. Now here's the kicker. Those four hormones, very helpful in so many ways. When those four hormone levels are very high in the body, it interferes with other structures in your brain that are trying to lay down the neural mechanisms of the memory. So it's one of those times where our body's kind of working at cross purposes. Those hormones are really helpful for fight, for flight, for mitigating the pain, but they cause cellular damage in two key structures of our brain that work to lay down a memory. What we've learned from the neurobiology of trauma research is that the memories of traumatic events are stored in a very disorganized way. When a survivor sits down and tries to explain to either a responding officer or detective what happened in the assault, and it starts coming out in this bits and pieces fragmented way of they start one thing but then they stop abruptly and then they start talking about something else, or they start explaining it very generally and then they start throwing in random details, it can be very confusing for law enforcement. And a lot of law enforcement, based on other training they've had, will look at that and say, this looks suspicious to me, because it seems like they're making it up as they're going along. They're not making it up as they're going along. They're having difficulty recalling the different pieces of the assault because of the way the trauma of the assault affected the way the memory is laid down. So for law enforcement, they see this completely disorganized, discombobulated presentation and they say, I'm not believing this. This seems made up to me. What they're really seeing is evidence of trauma. What they're really seeing is how trauma impacts memory formation and then memory recall. So I think it's important for law enforcement to keep in mind that when they see that really confusing stop, start, disorganized presentation, to think about that what they're seeing is trauma. What they're seeing is a survivor trying to reach into the different pieces and parts of their brain and all the different fragments of that memory, and they're doing their best to put it together and to give it back. Now the important thing to keep in mind is that the research is very clear that the accuracy of the memory is intact. So even though the storage is fragmented and can come out kind of sounding confusing and in bits and pieces, the actual recall, accurate. One way to explain how trauma affects memory is with a simple example of Post-it notes. Let's say that listening to this interview, you were trying to write down the information. And let's say rather than a nice tablet of paper, all I gave you was a Post-it note, a little tiny Post-it note. And that all you could do was write down the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. Well, depending upon the size of the Post-it note, you might be able to get a few words written down. You might, if you got a good sized Post-it note, you might be able to get several sentences down. Or if you got a good sized Post-it note, you'd be able to write many, many different things, okay? Now I want you to imagine trying to write down all the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. And I want you to gather them all up, and I want you to take them to a desk, the world's messiest desk, because that's really what the human brain is. And I want you to take all these little precious Post-it notes that have your notes on them, and I want you to scatter them all over the desk. I want you to put some on top. I want you to stick some underneath in the pile. I want you to put some in the interview that's about sexual assault. I want you to put some that says policies and procedures manual, obviously misfiled. Scatter it everywhere. Now, imagine trying to come back to that world's messiest desk 24 hours, 36 hours, 3 weeks, 6 months later. Find all of the Post-it notes, get them, put them in the correct order, and tell it back. That's what we're asking survivors to do when we're asking them to recall a traumatic event, when we're asking them to tell their story.